Welcome to the premiere of Teacher Talks with Michael Klotz, a series of conversations with some of my favorite string players about their beloved teachers. Today's Teacher Talk with world-renowned violinist Elmar Oliveira gives us an up-close and personal perspective of Elmar's teacher, Raphael Bronstein. Good morning, Elmar.
Good morning, Michael.
So great to see you in this era of social distancing and continued Zoom usage.
I know. It's terrible, but on the other hand, we've learned to deal with it, so it's good.
We're maximizing our possibilities.
I can always tell when my students are playing like out of rhythm or something is not right, because physically, that's basically we look at things, from a visual point of view. So that I can always tell. I can't always tell about sound and rushing because and then I say to my students, I say, "Are you rushing here?" And they say, "No." And I
No, it was the Zoom. Sometimes the Zoom goes faster for a few seconds, and then wait, is that the Zoom rushing?
Yeah, right.
Well, anyway, it's wonderful to be with you, and so the purpose of this interview is that we're going to talk about your teacher today, Mr. Raphael Bronstein, and Mr. Bronstein is somebody that. Well, I think I first heard about him through the Samuel Applebaum book, The Way They Play.
Right.
And that's where I remember getting my hands on those when I was a kid. And of course, being fascinated and learning about some wonderful artists who some of whom are still with us, thankfully, and that I've had the privilege of studying with and playing with. But if you could, I just wanted to know more about Mr. Bronstein. I think our viewers would really be curious to know about your experiences with him. I would say you're certainly one of his principal disciples. Yeah. So could you tell us how did you come to meet Mr. Bronstein? How did you decide to meet with him, to study with him at Manhattan School of Music and all of that?
Originally, I started with him in the preparatory division of Hart College of Music in Hartford, Connecticut, because I lived very close by, about 45 minutes to an hour close to Hart College. And basically, my brother was studying with him. John Oliveira was studying with him. So it was a natural thing for me to meet Bronstein through John. And I remember the first time I met him, I played for him a little bit, and he didn't take me as a student. He suggested different people that I could study with, and then he suggested his daughter, Ariana Braun, and Ariana was the one that came to my rescue and basically said, this boy is really terrific. You should really listen to him, blah, 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 and the whole thing. And that was great. But I remember going into Ariana Braun's lessons. That was his daughter also. Yes. And I remember being totally scared because, you'd walk into her studio at Hart College and, she'd be smoking and she'd be sitting at the piano and she'd say, "Play F sharp minor scale," so I'd get like this, and I'd play F sharp minor scale and then I'd play some more scales and then I'd play some double stop scales. She was a stickler for technique. Bronstein was not a stickler because basically He would say you have to practice scales every morning. You have to wake up and do your routine, and you have to practice double stop scales, octaves, fifths, the whole thing, tenths, blah blah blah, and basically, and he left that up to you.
Hmm.
So it was an interesting um, combination. Ariana, on the one hand, was a real stickler for technique. And Bronstein, on the other hand, was not so much that way. He was more into interpretive values.
Hmm. Hmm. And he, of course, had been a student of the legendary Leopold
Right.
Auer, right? And arrived, I believe that when he arrived in New York, he was Auer's assistant.
He was Auer's
Uh,
assistant, and in fact, they both fled Russia together on a boat.
oh, mm,
Um, I I think St. Petersburg, they went through Portugal, and Bronstein played a couple of concerts in Portugal, and then finally he came to the United States and arrived in the United States, and then he was our assistant, basically. And he used to have this very funny story about our when he came to this country. Our loved money, and he would, and his wife would be upstairs in the brownstone, and she would, and the student would ring the doorbell, and then the wife would go to the window and stick her head out the window, and she'd say, "Did you bring the money?" And then
wow.
she'd let them in. If they didn't bring the money, she wouldn't let them in.
Well, of course, back then they couldn't say, no, no, don't worry, I'll Venmo it to you. Wow, that's great. You know, one other thing among many that I wondered about Mr. Brownstein is, well, from what I've read, he was a child prodigy in
He
Russia,
was. And
right? But I don't know that there are many recordings of his, or that he did he perform much in the States, and if not, why? I mean, how did it?
he had a hand problem.
Okay,
Um, and basically, he was told when he was quite old already that the hand problem could have been solved.
mm,
And they would just have to, cut a little ligament or whatever. And so basically, that prevented him from playing. And he got
mm,
into teaching. So he was a very prominent teacher, and he didn't play very much. I think there was a recording of Bronstein with Max Tarr, who was one of his pupils, and obviously you heard the wonderful playing uh, on that
sure.
recording. But other than that, there was there was wasn't very much. There wasn't very much. I know that he gave concerts in Portugal, and then came to the United States, and maybe
Mm.
gave a few concerts in the United States, but mostly his emphasis was on teaching.
Hmm. Of course. Did he demonstrate at all in lessons? I mean, would he demonstrate occasionally, or
Yeah, he would
yeah.
demonstrate, and the violin playing was, I mean, it was at that point, he wasn't practicing, but you could tell that it was so natural that it was
Hmm.
just incredibly phenomenal. I mean, he'd pick
Yeah.
up the fiddle and he'd play, and he'd have a cigar hanging from his mouth, and most of the time, the ashes would hit the violin. And it would be really horrible. The violin was basically in pieces. It would be so great. I mean, you'd hear the playing, and you'd think, wow, he really knows how to play the violin.
I've always found that interesting. You know, when you think about, well, you know, performers such as yourself. I mean, you are one of America's finest violinists, and you've performed the entire violin repertoire, and I like to say and more because you've commissioned pieces as well with most of the major orchestras. And so I always have thought, like, as you know, I studied with Zvi Zeitlin, who was a very
Yes,
important
you
violinist
must.
and had a major career as well. And for me, I felt that when I was studying with Zvi, I really learned things
Yeah.
well because I was drawing from, and Zvi used to say, um, it's very rare to find a true pedagogue who hasn't gotten up there and played the stuff, played the repertoire under fire. But there have been exceptions,
There have
so
been. There have been exceptions. But a lot of people think a great pedagogue is, someone that always has had the experience of getting up there and playing the concerti and blah, 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 and all this stuff. But that's not necessarily true. I mean, um, just like a great talent could come from anywhere, could come from Hoboken, New Jersey, or
sure.
basically the teachers are the same way.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, so someone like Mr. Bronstein, it seems like, of course, he had uh, such extensive and rigorous training as a
Yeah.
student of our, and so he knew the repertoire. I guess my point is to say that even though he may not have played the Brahms concerto 200 times in concert, he
Oh
knew
yeah,
it, and he knew what it took to get through it
he
and to
did
play it.
know it. He did know it, and it's interesting because he was in the class with Milstein,
Mhm.
which was it was there Diana Hansen was in that class. Um, um, Milstein was in that class. There were a lot of violinists that were in that class.
Mhm.
You'd see a picture every time you went to his studio. You'd see a picture of the entire class, and I was sitting
Wow.
in front of them, um, and so that was really important because when when Heifetz auditioned for the class, he didn't get in because of the Jewish thing. You had to
Mhm.
be
Right.
Jewish to
Yeah.
go study in Petrograd at that time, um, and so then he got in the following year, and of course, I mean, he was the greatest violinist of all time, I think.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
And and did so I wonder if did Mr. Bronstein maintain relationships in the United States with his former hour classmates such as Heifetz, Milstein, Cymbalist? Did he have associations with them at all, or?
um, I think he had a very brief associations with different people that were taught by our,
Mhm.
but not so much. Not so much. I thought most of the time he would just be in his studio. He would teach from morning till night, basically.
Yeah.
7 days a week, and that would be it. That would be it.
And he's of course most known for teaching at the Manhattan School and the Hart
Right.
School. But I was reading that he taught at a lot of places. He taught at Queens College
Right.
and the Graduate Center at CUNY, and so he was.
Also, he taught in Philadelphia. When he was our assistant, he came to this country, and then he traveled down to Philadelphia to teach there.
Wow.
Um, and basically, that was the gist of his teaching most of the time.
So again, if you could clarify for us, or maybe shed some light on something that I've always heard about, and I've always, of course, I would say that two of the most revered pedagogues, if not the two, uh, of the 20th century in New York were Bronstein and Galamian. I would say they were probably the
That's
two most
true.
important, and so, but then I've always heard that there was kind of a rivalry between them, or maybe even I heard that there was a hatred. But so I wonder if you could shed some light for us on that.
Galamian always spoke of Bronstein very highly as a teacher and as a pedagogue. He would constantly say Bronstein is a very good teacher, blah blah blah. The entire thing. It was mostly Bronstein who who didn't regard Galamian as a great teacher. Uh,
And why? Why was that? Why do you think that was?
I think because first of all, he couldn't play the violin that well. I mean,
Hmm.
there were he apparently he was the violinist in the Bolshoi
Hmm.
originally
Yeah.
in the Bolshoi orchestra, and then he went to Paris, and he got a lot of the Franco-Belgian school involved in the teaching, and
Yeah.
um, and that was good. That was good.
Well, so and that brings me to another point. If we can get technical
Yeah,
for a moment, that I'm a product of Galamian's teaching. Most of my teachers, and in fact, Zvi Zeitlin was, I believe, one of his
right.
first wave of
Exactly.
students. And so, I learned to hold the bow more like
Yeah.
this, right? Would you say that Bronstein was a little more of what people think of the Russian
Oh,
school of holding
absolutely.
the bow?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There was no Franco-Belgian influence in Bronstein's teaching. It was mostly this
Hmm.
kind of thing, with the bow arm,
Hmm.
and because that was that really created that entire thing. And if you look at Heifetz, it's also this kind of thing.
Sure.
It's in fact it's very tilted this way.
Yeah.
Um, and basically that was the gist of his teaching. There was no Franco-Belgian school, and I thought that actually this idea of 1 and 3 is really kind of a very interesting idea and very good
Hmm.
and very good.
So if somebody came to Bronstein with that background,
Yeah.
right? Would he change the way that they held the bow, or would he sort of work with what they had? What was his approach in that regard?
Well, I think Bronstein didn't like to change things unless they were absolutely necessary.
Hmm.
When there were interpretive things that he felt were very uh, very important, he would do it. He would change it. Um, the technique itself, I mean, really, I don't know that he would change the technique of someone playing.
Okay. And you had mentioned earlier that his daughter Ariana was the
Yeah.
stickler for technique, um, and he not so much. But did he advocate that his students practice scales and
Oh,
etudes
absolutely.
and things?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So which methods? I'm curious. Which methods did he
You
support, or did
know,
he
one of the
find?
things that he wasn't a big fan of was the flesh system because it
Hmm.
takes a long time to really do all the augmented, the diminished, and
Yeah.
it takes forever and ever. And so,
I use flashlight with my students,
yeah,
just a little bit of it. Yeah.
basically he used Hirmali,
Oh, okay.
the end of the
Yes.
book and the 3 octave scales, and basically then double stop scales, third, sixth octaves, tenths, etc., fingered octaves. Those were the things that basically he used in his teaching,
Hmm.
and as I said, he left a lot of that to the student. He
Hmm.
was
Hmm.
not, for instance, you came into a lesson, you didn't study, you didn't immediately start on scales, and occasionally he would ask for a scale,
Mhm.
and a double stop scale or whatever. And that was mostly in the beginning. Then he'd let you do your thing, and and most of the time he would spend on interpretation of short pieces, sonatas, concerti, etc., etc.
Mhm. What about studies, Elmar? Kreutzer Road, Paganini,
Those, yeah,
any of that kind of
Paganini
stuff?
he was very adept at Paganini,
Mhm.
and basically, we spent a lot of time on Paganini. We spent a lot of time on Kreutzer. We spent a lot of time on Rode. We spent a lot of time
Mhm.
on Gavinier.
Right. Because part of my goal with these conversations is to have students um,
Yeah,
watch them and learn from them, and it's neat for students to see that someone like
yeah.
you practiced when you were a kid, that you practiced these
Oh,
etudes.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in fact, my students, I tell my students when you warm up with this exercise, you warm up with whole tone scales. I mean, with basically with one note to a bow scales, and then you speed it up a little bit
Yeah.
and so forth and so on. And then the etudes, very important to study Rode and in fact, some of my students, when they come to me and they haven't played Rode, I say you've got to get the Rode right away because
It so
Oscar
helps them.
Shumsky was,
You read my mind, Elmar. I was just thinking
yeah,
about, even on the
he,
viola, I
he
said, no, you have
recorded
to listen
all
to,
of them.
yeah. Well, of course, they had the Rhodes Strat, or
Yeah,
one of
right,
them. Yeah.
right.
Wow. I heard a
Because they're
story.
musically
It's one of
really
these.
good. They're musically really
Oh yeah. Well, they're caprices, right? So they could be, I heard a story once. It's one of these. Who knows if it's true stories, but it's a good story that I like to tell my students that Heifetz, before his final performance with the LA Phil, granted an interview to somebody from the LA
yeah.
Times, and they showed up to his place in Malibu and a little bit early, and they heard him practicing as they approached the house, and he was practicing Kreutzer etudes. If it's true, it's a really a testament to the fact that you never
Absolutely.
stop practicing your fundamentals.
Absolutely. You always practice your fundamentals. You always practice, vibrato. You always practice the entire, scales. Without vibrato, okay. It's one thing to do it without vibrato, but it's another thing to do it with vibrato also. Because you learn, basically, if you play one note to a bow, you learn how to sustain the vibrato from one note to the next.
Well, when I was a student once in '99 at the Sarasota Festival, Joey Silverstein was sort of the premier
Right.
teacher there, and of course I was a violinist, and I we walked into his studio once and we heard him practicing the most beautiful D major scale. It was just so beautiful. And I said, "Oh, Mr. Silverstein, do you vibrate when you practice scales?" He said, "Oh, absolutely." He said, "The scale is your opportunity to fall in love with your own sound." That stuck with me, so I kind of
That's
like that.
great.
Turning back to Mr. Bronstein, Elmar, and this, I'm having so much fun. This is really,
Great.
really fun. I wanted to know about his. Was he very supportive of his students? Did he take an interest in? Well, I mean, did he take an interest in their personal lives or their kind of mental well-being, or was probably he was so busy that he had to stay focused on the
I think
violin?
most of the time he didn't really get personal with you in a very deep kind of way, like ask you
Mhm.
about your family or your relationships with your girlfriend or whatever, or your boyfriend or
Right.
whatever. It doesn't, at this point, it really doesn't matter. Um, so that didn't happen, but
Yeah.
on the other hand, he was supportive when, of course, of the violin playing. very, very
Hmm.
much
Hmm.
so. In fact, he would adjudicate certain competitions, and you'd think, wait a minute, it's going the other way, because like it wasn't that great. I mean, come on,
Hmm.
it
And
wasn't that great. Come on.
when you went to the Tchaikovsky competition, of course, um, you were a little bit older,
Yes,
right? You were not a 17-year-old
right.
prodigy at that point. And so you had already finished your formal studies,
Yes,
correct? Or
I had finished my formal studies.
but did you? I always wondered if you returned to play for
Oh,
Mr.
I did.
Bronstein after you finished or before the competition or
I
something.
did. In fact, I
Yeah.
played most of the repertoire that was in the Tchaikovsky competition, and certain things, like, for instance, the Allemande of the Bach.
Hmm.
For some reason, he he wanted it very slow. And that's the way I played it. And then I
Hmm. Hmm.
rethought it, and I thought, to the E, you know? And finally, I arrived at that conception of the piece, so that it's always flowing. Um, a lot of things, and he considered himself to be an expert on Bach.
Hmm.
That was the one thing that he thought, I know Bach. He studied Bach with Richard Burgen, who was the
Oh,
concertmaster of, and I think
awesome.
Burgen was also a pupil of Leopold Auer
Yeah.
and really knew how to play Bach. But that was something that I gradually got a little bit away from this,
Hmm.
this
Well,
because I think that first of all, Bach can be played many different ways.
sure.
And second of all, I think there are quite a number of good teachers who have real conceptions of Bach,
Oh yeah,
you
absolutely.
know?
Was he? Was it sort of what people would say a very romantic Bach? Vibrato and slow and that kind of thing, or was it just what would you say
It,
were some
it
of the?
was a romanticized Bach, but on the other hand, like cadences were not really drawn out. They were
Hmm.
they were very proportionate. So in that respect, I think that the Bach was maybe a little bit more modern
Hmm.
in a certain sense. But then again, it hailed back to this thing that he was used to. Um, and, I think, for instance, I think people play Bach much better now.
Hmm. It's really interesting. Zvi Zeitlin, he really had a sense of humor, as I think you probably
Yeah.
remember, and he said once when a student was kind of trying to play authentic and with no vibrato and that kind of thing, and Zvi normally he would get very very angry, but he was actually quite calm, and he said, Bach played completely devoid of warmth. Couldn't really be Bach because he had something like 20
Yeah.
children, and you can't do that. You can't do that with intelligence alone.
And
I
the
was like,
thing about the Baroque was more closely associated with the Romantic school than it was with the classical school.
sure, sure, and I think it's a myth that people think that that you can't vibrate even if you're a quote unquote a baroque
That's right.
specialist. Some of my favorite violinists and other musicians. They use vibrato, albeit more
Yeah, of
sparingly,
course,
but they
of
still
course,
use it. Yeah,
of course.
yeah,
Yeah.
wonderful. Um, so I was gonna ask you if you could just talk about Mr. Bronstein's family a little bit. I mean, you mentioned his daughter. Could you tell us a little bit? Did he have a wife and any other children that you?
He had a wife, and I remember that uh, when his wife passed away, he went into a severe depression, really severe depression.
Mhm.
And basically he locked himself up for like a month. And
Oh wow.
that was it. I mean, he couldn't he couldn't and, you know, she was a very privileged person. She went to, to shows, she went to Broadway shows, she went to opera, she went to so many different things in New York. And that's the way he lived his life with her. But I think that there was a genuine sense of loss there.
Sure, as could be
Yeah,
expected. Did you maintain a friendship with him until the end? I believe he died in 87 or
pretty much.
88. Were you,
Pretty much. Yeah.
yeah. Would he come to your concerts
He came to
sometimes?
my
And
concerts. He would come to my concerts. I would go and play for him on occasion,
wonderful.
different things, and it was quite revealing in in a lot of senses. It was very you know proportion was a huge big deal to him. And
Mhm.
if you didn't do something in proportion, then it was no good. So
Okay.
that was very important. Every retard, every calando had to be in proportion. It's like he used to say, all of a sudden you're driving a car, you come to a red light, you don't all of a sudden go boom. You stop. You put on the brake. You slow down gradually.
That's a great analogy.
Oh,
Yeah.
and so I thought about this, and I thought, it's really it makes a lot of sense.
And I noticed that in your teaching, because I've seen you give several wonderful master classes, you talk about that also.
Yeah,
So I was going to say we're often a product of our
yeah,
teachers, especially if we had wonderful teachers. And yeah, can you talk about some other ideas
yeah.
or
I talk,
philosophies of
I
Mr.
talk a
Bronstein that
lot
you
a
use?
lot about visual intonation
Hmm.
because Bronstein was constantly involved in visual intonation. You look at the fingerboard when you play. You
Hmm.
know the distance of the thumb and first finger, the thumb and second finger, the thumb and third finger, and basically everything is kept pretty much even between first and, let's say, fourth position.
Hmm.
Everything. And by the way, I played a lot for Milstein over the
Hmm.
years, and that was one of the things um, that I learned from Milstein because I would watch him, and the
Hmm.
economy of motion was unbelievable. It was just
Yeah,
stupendous. He never moved anything from first to fourth position. And then all of a sudden the body of the instrument came in play with the hand, and then the palm of the hand, the thumb and the and the thumb and the finger would be really important.
Milstein is, and I'm so glad you mentioned Milstein. It's an example that I try to use with my students, and I'm sure you see this too. Often, students kind of
Yeah,
move artificially, or things in the left hand are not economical, as you were
right.
saying. And if you watch truly great artists, they do that.
That's right.
Most.
They play with their hands. They
Yeah,
don't
that's
move around and do all of this really nonsensical stuff. If you take as an example Heifetz and Oistrakh and all of the, like Kogan and all the great ones, and even Stern, I mean,
Solid. Yeah.
Really. I mean, this is so visual intonation is something that I think a lot about. Not only visual intonation up and down the fingerboard, but across the fingerboard,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
you have parallel distances across the
Hmm.
fingerboard. So if you're going from the G string to the D string, and you're doing a whole step across, you basically have a whole step. That's And
Hmm.
then you have a step and a half, third finger, and then fourth finger, like a whole step. Then you've got, so you have that. You have also this block of 1 to 4
Hmm.
all the time, all the times, and until you get basically to fourth position, you have the block of 1 to 4, and then you've got the thumb. Then you've got the thumb when you meet the body of the instrument. Then you've got the thumb, and it's very important to think about the thumb and the fingers
Hmm.
all the time, because that's really
Sure.
important.
Absolutely. And did Mr. Bronstein advocate practicing double stops to help with intervals? And I know
Yeah.
that's something that you've talked about.
Yes. Always,
Yeah.
because and by the way, Bronstein would, like, he would say, when you play thirds, you always think of the bottom finger.
Hmm.
So 3, 4, 3, 2. I mean 4, and then 3 again, and so forth and so on. And then when you play octaves, you basically, again, the bottom finger. You're always adjusting the fingers to the bottom finger.
Hmm.
If
Yeah.
you make sure that the finger is really in tune, then this is real easy to do.
Yeah. No, that's great. Oh, that's so helpful. Yeah. One thing about double stops I always loved, Roberto
Yeah.
Diaz said in a class, um, fourths and fifths don't lie. So if you're playing a piece and your fourth or your fifth is out of tune, well, it's
That's
out of tune.
right.
I love that.
That's right.
And I use that all the time with my students. Um, Elma, I think we're getting close to the end. Is there anything else that you
Yeah,
can
by the
add
way,
for
just
for
adding
us?
to what you said, when you play
Yeah,
fourths,
yeah,
usually it's the top finger that's a little bit flat.
sure, sure.
It actually, it needs to go up a tiny bit, so that it's really in tune.
Wow, yeah, that's great. Well, this is going to be helpful
Fifths,
for everyone.
fifths are like flesh on top or flesh on the bottom. It depends on the fiddle.
Right, yeah. So I know we're getting. This is interesting. So I've always wondered, do you maneuver? You sometimes, I have trouble explaining to my students. Sometimes they have to maneuver the
Yep.
finger even within a fifth, so it's in
Oh,
tune.
absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sure.
Before we quit, I wanted to know, Mr. Bronstein did write a book.
Yes.
I believe it's called "The Science of Violin
Yeah.
Playing." Can you tell us a little bit about that book, and is it still in print? And
Yes, it's still in print because Ariana's daughter printed the book recently, and it's got
Mhm.
Bronstein's picture on the front. It used
Okay,
to be published by Axelrod and his company and Paganini.
Herbert
Yeah,
Axelrod.
Herbert Axelrod. And then it went out of publication, and then it came back in again. So it's still available. It's a great book. It's a great
Yeah.
book. I mean, so many people have told me about that book, and just think it's really a very excellent.
Terrific. I'll see if I can dig up a link where
Yeah,
people could order
yeah.
it, and if so, we'll share it. Well, Elmar, thank you so much for
You're
doing
very
this. Was
welcome.
my first time interviewing someone and or in this fashion.
You
So
did great.
I hope this was well. I hope many people will watch this, and this really was very a wonderful way for us to know more about such an important figure and someone who was, of course, so important to
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much.
So okay, stay well, and hope to see you
Yeah.
soon.
You too. Like.
Okay, bye, Elmar. Thanks.